Hi everyone. So here is the fourth video of the series about Budo in life, personal life, education, where I receive people for now living in Japan with an extensive experience of Budo. And today, this is Marc. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for inviting.
Very happy to have you here. We've had a few conversations in the past that were extremely interesting. So really looking forward to hearing what you have to say today.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Can you please start with a short introduction, your background in martial arts and the reasons you came to Japan and what you're doing now?
Sure. I started practicing martial arts in 2003, I think. I first joined a COO Wizcorp dojo. So basically, it was just a local dojo where they would teach Kyokushin karate, some judo with with a lot of focus on ground fighting. There was some aikido, but I don't think there was anyone who was from an aikido background there. So it was a little bit different. And there was also an effort on synthesis, so basically trying to find ways to use all of that, which if you study Gendai Budo, I guess it makes sense. If you go further back in history, then you start to realize that, well, that's kind of where it started. Then from there in 2006, I actually went to France for an internship. I studied a little bit of judo there, small, about as big as here, kind of judojo, with a very old man that I found on Google. But when I came back, there was a new face at the dojo that was training and was wearing a black belt. So new face, black belt. Been training there for a couple of years. I go to my sensei. I ask, "Who is this?" And he tells me, "Well, he's someone who just moved with his wife from Japan. He lived there for 10 years. Later on, I would learn that he actually studied." I believe it's philology, the study of ancient European languages in the Imperial University in Sendai. Went all the way to PhD there. Actually started in Indian studies. So yeah, kind of an interesting background. But at the time, basically, he just told me he's someone who's practicing Daito Ryu, which I knew by name. And that was it. Basically, I kind of started to train with him, and my teacher at the time in COO Wizcorp was somebody who's very kind-hearted. So basically, somebody who would help anyone with legitimate background to either get set up, do their own thing, and just kind of expand the playing field, so to speak. And the dojo was basically divided. It was actually one location, but there were 3 training areas that we could use. And on Saturday, the man I started to train with, I'm not saying his name because he's very private, and I think he'd prefer that. But basically, he started to teach Seito Jodo at first. And so that's how I got started with him. And I did a little bit of Seite Jodo. It was a little bit informal, but we'd do the training drills. Later on, he did a little bit of Iaido, but I didn't participate. And after a while, he had very few students. Basically coming to train with him was maybe 2. I think overall it was maybe 4 people while I was there. And he, after we would do the Jodo training, he would pull me aside and he would say, like, grab me like this, grab me like that, and basically started to practice what later on I would learn would be, Daito Ryu. But I didn't know what it was, so I was just doing the grab and he would throw me, and therefore I started very early in Daito Ryu, just like doing the ukemi and at least having to figure it out so that I don't get hurt. From there, I figured out, well, he's doing things differently, and he has a different perspective on things. He doesn't talk about it a lot, but whatever he says, you can feel there's something that's a little bit different about it, and that piqued my interest. So I set up a first trip in 2007, and I went to the Daito Ryu Honbu Dojo in Katsushika, and I went to the Yoshinkan Aikido in Shin.
Yeah,
relatively close to Shinjuku, more in the west. I forget the name of the station. And my teacher basically told me, well, you probably want to train with Chida Sensei when you go to Yoshinkan. So I got the chance to train a little bit in Yoshinkan there. I knew nothing of it, so it was just kind of experience. And then after that, it was basically Daito Ryu. And I did this for 2 weeks. It was just a very short trip, kind of an introduction to Japan, the culture, everything. Was basically just lost all the time. So what I remember of the trip mostly is, just walking a lot. Just getting lost all the time and walking a lot.
It was a time there was no Google Map, right?
There was, but I just...
Oh, no.
You have to understand. Like, and I had the same thing when I went to Europe. I come from North America. In North America, our roads are always in right angle. If you get lost, there's maybe something wrong with you. But when you go to other countries and you're not used to having roads that go in all kinds of direction, and Tokyo is very much like that.
France is pretty messy, but Tokyo is a nightmare.
Exactly. So I just had a very, very hard time to kind of figure out my way. So I just ended up walking a lot. As a matter of fact, when I first went to the Daito Ryu Dojo, the only reason why I ended up finding it, I got lost a few times already before I went to the Honbu Dojo the first time. And when you know where it is, it's not hard to get there. But silly me not knowing how to travel properly. I had gotten lost a few times already before, so I figured out, okay, I'm gonna leave early. I left my training was like at 7 or 8, and I left like at 3. And I arrived after the training ended. And the only reason why I actually ended up finding my way is because I knew I was in the area, but I just couldn't find a place. And there was a komeyasan that was closing. And I just walked in. I figured out, I'm just going to at this point, I'm just going to try to ask. And I don't speak Japanese, so I tried to just, explain. I had a Google Map, so that's why I know Google Map. We had a Google Map at the time. I was trying to explain where I was trying to go. And there's an old elderly woman that just like in her slippers just like slowly walked to me, and I have a tattoo on my left arm with kanji, and she goes and she lifts my shirt, I had like a half sleeve shirt. She starts to lift it. She goes like this, there's a second that passes. Kondo-san. and then like she just says something which to this day I assume must have been like, no, he wants to go to Mr. Kondo's house or offices. They're all in the same place. Just pulling with him. That's how I ended up finding the place. And I arrived late, and at the time there was, I think, one other foreigner that was training there, a Russian guy, and he's the one who greeted me. He's probably the most silent person and stern person that I've ever met, and so I felt already pretty bad. And he wasn't more serious or more stern than his usual self, but I took it as, well, okay, I screwed up, and he's not happy about it. But going back to the story, basically I I spent about 2 weeks in Japan. I went back to Canada. And then in 2009, I figured out, oh, what the hell, how about I try to just, go for a few months and see how it goes. And so I quit my job. I took my savings and I came to Japan for 2 months, and I tried a few more things at a time. So this is where I started to train in Iaido. I also I also did a little bit of judo at the Kodokan, but in the free training sessions.
And it's hard if you don't know anyone, right?
I didn't find it hard, actually. I had a great experience.
People were like taking you in? Maybe the foreigners group?
No, I was I remember training almost only with Japanese people.
Great.
And as a matter of fact, I actually remember, well, first of all, he's relatively not well known, but there's a Kosen Judo teacher called Okada, I forget his first name right now, but Okada Sensei. And he pulled me in, and I trained with him for a while at some point. He would, it was free training, but he would pull me in and say, okay, this is how you do that, and so on and so forth, which gave me a completely different perspective on Newaza and Judo, obviously, because it's just completely different what he was doing, right? But I also got, I don't know if you ever went to the Kodokan Judo, but in the free training session, you have basically all the younger people are on one side. You have actual classes going on this side, where if you're facing forward there, you're kind of on this quadrant.
I went there for visits,
right.
Visiting a few times. But we had someone here a few years ago who was training at the Kodokan Judoka, who was a teacher in France. Came here for a few years, and then he had quite a hard time. No controversy expected, but he's black, so that might not have helped. I don't know.
Sure, sure. And we can get back on the subject of race later on a little bit, but there's also the I've seen groups of foreigners come to training in that period, and they had trouble. I think, that's at least as far as I recall. But for me, I just went to people and I politely asked, again, not speaking Japanese. I just went there and then tried to train. I got beaten most of the time. That was a good experience. But anyway, I did that. I did a little bit of something called Daidojuku in Ikebukuro, which is also kind of a Sogo Bujutsu kind of thing. It's basically Kyokushin Karate with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu kind of thing. It's very popular apparently in Russia. At the time when I went there, it was relatively unknown. I just thought it would be interesting. So I did that, and through those connections, I ended up doing other seminars and practices. Basically, during that 2-month period, I would train 2 to 3 times a day, depending on the day. And from there, when I was about to leave, I think it was about on my last training at the Hombu Dojo in Katsushika in Daito Ryu, Kondo Sensei comes to see me and says, "So you're going to be coming this summer?" Right? It's end of May. He's asking, "Are you going to be there in August?" And I didn't think about it. I said, "Yeah, I'll be there." And I wasn't aware of that, but basically that was the 150th anniversary of Sokaku Sensei's birth, and the 50th anniversary of the Katsushika Dojo. So that's why he was asking. I had said yes. I was already out of the job for 2 months, and I had spent a lot of my savings. So when I went back to Canada, I tried to scrap some money together to be able to go back again. I went there for 2 weeks. It was basically, there's a gashiku every year in Katsura, and that's where we went. We went to train there, and after the gashiku, I figured out, okay, well, I still have no idea what's going on here, but I know there's something. And the judo thing, the other practices were interesting, but that's not was intriguing to me. That's not where I saw what I think I initially saw with my teacher in Canada, and I figured out I'm going to need to come here for at least 3 years to learn more. And so, and I wasn't very patient. So again, in a situation where financially it's a little bit challenging, now come back for 2 weeks in August in Japan, and I moved in, and then I finally moved in Japan in October of the same year. So that's the story of how I got here. In so many words.
How did you manage to find a job here?
That was quite challenging. I basically applied everywhere. I was already on a tight budget, so I basically found one of those dormitory kind of place where they have bunk beds. And I just settled there, which was great also from a social perspective, because I just got to mingle with a lot of people instead of sometimes when you go and you get like a share house, that kind of things, it's kind of easy to miss people and not, end up not necessarily meeting a lot of people and initially. So I just applied everywhere, and I found a job at a small company that was just starting, which is the company I'm still working with right now. I started there as a web engineer. I was doing web development at the time, and then from there I just kind of helped that company grow to what it is today, which is the game development studio that's part of a larger international conglomerate. And we work with all the big studios right now in Japan, or at least some of them. Historically, we've worked with a lot of them.
Well, that was kind of a good luck, right? The job you found. I know more or less what you're doing, and it sounds kind of fun and nice, and people there look nice too. So, working in Japan is often a huge challenge for foreigners.
So I think it depends on the type of foreigner. Some people are more flexible, a little bit more open, and they tend to have a little less of a challenge. You visited and you've met my boss, and you visited a bit, and
it doesn't look like a typical Japanese company.
No, I don't think it is, and it's not built to be that. We're definitely an international company in the sense of we're trying to really mix and match the cultures, right, and find a way to do cultural integration, which traditionally is not how it's done in Japan. In Japan, traditionally you're gonna have your madoguchi that's going to be Japanese, and your back office that's going to be foreigners, right? Or at least in engineering it tends to be like that. Or at least in smaller companies. Bigger companies have a very different synergy, I think. But at Wizcorp we're really trying to get a certain edge from the cultural integration, cultural blending, right? The way I tend to talk about it is to say that Japan is essentially a cultural engine that takes anything it can and then turns it into something that it's theirs. And to me, if we can be part of that process as foreigners, bring in some material, and be part of obviously it's not just a one-way process. There's a lot of back and forth, but if you can be part of that process, I think there's a lot of value that can be created.
Yeah, I totally agree with the vision. It's interesting to see sometimes when you express your Western ideas publicly, and you have like foreigners saying, "How do you dare teaching Japanese? What they should do?" And actually, it's not that. It's just I'm giving what I know, my perspective, and then they can do whatever they want with it.
Sure.
But historically speaking, Japan was quite welcomed outside ideas and integrated them into their own culture. And I think it's a very interesting synergy, even though it can be challenging to communicate this way, because most of the time I think Japanese people would like at first not really accept what you're bringing.
Well, if
But
they don't
with
have
time,
if they don't have a reason to,
Yeah.
right? If it ain't broken, don't fix it. That's a seminal rule in Japanese culture. I think it's all in the message. It's not in the message, it's in the format. And as a foreigner, if you try to explain things like a foreigner, even if you do it in Japanese, it's not going to go. Unless the person was already, predisposed to your idea.
Yeah, or educated in the US or that kind of...
Yeah, exactly, right? So either they are aware of your format of communication and they're fine with it, they understand, how to interpret it, or they have a certain open-mindedness that makes it so that's like, okay, well, that's an interesting thought, at least, right? In general, already, if you propose something and you're not going to get a yes or a no, you're going to get a silence if they don't agree with you, right? And if you don't understand that, you might feel like you're coming across and you're convincing when you're not. When instead, your reaction should be to try to align with their viewpoint first and then try to start from there and say, but there's also this other thing, right? So I think it's, I think a lot of the cultural challenges that comes with, there might be that, comes from, just, making sure, if you use the right format, I think you can get into a meaningful conversation. And, the feedback that you're going to get is definitely going to be different. Doesn't mean you're going to convince people, but at the very least you're going to get, you're going to get that back and forth that I think is valuable. And sometimes you're just wrong, so it's always good to say no, but here's my opinion, and maybe you're going to be the one who's going to be convinced, right? So,
well, some people have this natural ability to communicate with others, including with Japanese. Some don't. What do you think the Budo practice or Koryu practice can bring to people in the sense of bettering the understanding between people?
Well, it starts with Reigi, right? I think. To me, everything starts with Reigi. At least in the West, I get the impression that Reigi is just some let's be nice to each other idea, when there's a lot more depth to that. And it's not because the concept doesn't exist historically in the West. At least, if we talk about military culture, for instance, right? As I recall, the reason why you're going to have the military saluting like this, it comes from knights in armor, raising their visor to be able to recognize each other, right? So that they don't end up,
I mean, there is a meaning behind.
Yeah, it's a symbol today, but there's a reason behind that, and the way you compose yourself is also something that they're going to drill into you in boot camp, right? As I understand, I've never been in the military myself, but in the context of Koryu, I mean, you have entire schools dedicated to Reigi, right? And there's a reason for that. That goes beyond just being nice to each other. And I think one of the fundamental, if you take the idea of Reigi and of, where it starts from, I think, or where it ought to start from, it's just from pure being, observant, right? You look around you. If you envision, like the way I see it is I envisioned Japan 400 years ago, 500 years ago before unification. And you look at Japan today and you know that there's a lot of fragmentation in the culture, right? Every little area is going to have their own little subculture, their own little traditions, right? And Reigi at the time must have been the same thing, right? The way you actually show manner and politeness was probably done differently. So if you have, if you're from, the south and you go up north, you're going to have to keep your eyes wide open not to offend someone, knowing very well that if you offend someone, you might start a war. Now, obviously, if you're talking about everyday life, that seems rather extreme, I think. But it is, if you think about it in those terms, if you practice with, I think, in the context of Koryu, obviously, or Budo, if you practice with that in mind, then I think, what you learn there is obviously useful in just everyday conversation, especially in an international environment. Because we're just in the same kind of situation. You go into another country, you go into a new area, or like somebody else's office, and they have a different company culture and whatnot, right? You have to look around. You have to be perceptive of how people do things and try to do it like them, right? That's where it starts for me, and it comes from very practical needs, and it can be put to very practical use.
Reigi is a form of state of mind beyond the practice itself.
Yes. There's a good, I think it's Alexander in one interview I saw online, he was talking about a different subject, and I think that, subject came in, and I remember he was talking about, military rotation in Afghanistan when you had, call them a new soldier incoming, and they were in a relatively hostile area having, and then they came across a funeral procession of people from a nearby village that wasn't known as being allies, and the officer in charge basically asked everyone to just take a knee, right? And for their whole rotation, they weren't attacked. Be respectful, be mindful. It has an impact, right? And again, that's one. It's a very different environment than what we're doing today, as just plain people, but the lessons are no less valuable. I think the extreme perhaps might help crystallize the lessons to be learned, if anything. But it's the lessons are the same, and the applications are absolutely valuable, I think.
Well, I also think that having the same code of Reigi to show your respect to other people helps, in the sense that you don't necessarily know how the other person will take the way you're showing respect. So he might just misunderstand you, and it's not his fault, it's your fault, because that's your role to be understood. It's not the other people to make the effort to understand you. And well, you can think it is, but then you lose the control of the situation. So actually, if you want to be in control, you have the responsibility to be understood. And this whole Reigi thing is interesting, in the sense that when you get to a dojo, in my case in Aikido, or even in other Budo, even if it's slightly changes, if you show proper Reigi as you learned it in your own dojo, you always create this common ground from which you can start talking and practicing if you're in a dojo. I think when Reigi is different, it's much more difficult. I think international environment must be quite difficult. But I have the feeling that what you are explaining is also connected with the concept of Zanshin, or being aware of the of things around you, and then being able to, without thinking of it, adapting yourself to the environment.
I'm going to rewind just for a moment. So again, I think Reigi needs to be understood in from the perspective of you're trying to achieve a goal, task, mission, right? And again, I understand that I'm framing it in a very particular context. If you go to another school and you don't get the chance to see how they show respect, maybe the best option is obviously to use what you know and try to show respect, right? Make the best effort you can. But at the same time, a lot of generally it's kind of it's one of the reasons why you do Kengaku a couple of times before you go and train somewhere, right? So you have some familiarity with all those things.
Yeah, that's important because many people think that Kengaku is about seeing if you like the technique or not and you make your choice, but it's not.
It's actually the entire opposite. It's does the school like you?
Yeah. And
in many cases.
Get the very basics that you will need to get yourself accepted in the school. So it's...
Yes, so your role is that. Your role is to figure out, well, obviously, if you don't like it, you're not going to come back, right? So, but it presupposes you have at least some interest. So you're trying to confirm that interest. But yes, you have an active role when you go and watch class there, right? And one of which is you have to adjust your manner according to circumstances. Like a good example is like when in Japanese culture is when two Japanese people who don't know each other are introduced to each other by a third party. Yeah. Right? And you have like keigo and you have like different levels of politeness in Japanese, and you're going to see they're going to start a certain level. And within 5 minutes of conversation,
there's an adjustment.
Exactly, right? So maybe that's one way to put it. That's a little bit more like closer to a casual environment, but that's the idea. But I think I strongly believe that you have to adapt if you want to be polite to someone, and especially if you walk into their house, their ecosystem. In general, depending on what you're trying to achieve, accomplish, the reason why you're there, those are all going to be elements that are going to change the way you're going to approach, engaging with people, right?
Some could argue that in Gendai Budo you would be accepted anyway, but the way they will teach you and the way the place you will have in the dojo won't be the same if you show proper respect and reigi, and if you don't. So just getting through the door doesn't mean that you're going to get what you should, and you're just going to get what you deserve, and what you deserve depends on what you're giving. So
sure. Now going back to Zanshin, there's some connection in terms of having a heightened state of attention, but in my view, that's not something that's necessarily specific to Zanshin, right? It's not specific. It's part of the practice, right? The moment you start to do kata, you're at the heightened state of attention, right? What defines Zanshin is really you're putting everything that's left on the table. And you're really making it clear that this is where it stops, or at least that's my interpretation of it.
Now, I was just thinking about something that Alex Bennett wrote about, like useful danshin, not the true sense of the concept, I think, but what you can easily translate to everyday life with danshin, like. Taking a receipt in a taxi, so if you forgot something in the taxi, you have the receipt and you can call the guy, or meaning you have this state of mind that you are aware of your surroundings, and you are aware that you are not aware of everything, but as much as you can, or stay conscious of what's happening around you. Although I think that probably the real sense of danshin is being able to do that without thinking of it. But
like the example of taking a receipt, for instance, for me is just being polite, right? Again, I would connect it more to say reigi personally. But maybe I'm misunderstood. Maybe my interpretation is not correct. I mean, Alex knows what he's talking about. So
no, but that's
Dr. Bennett, I should say, sorry.
No, I mean, I think he would slap you if you call him doctor, even if he has 2 PhDs. No, it's just in a context where I think, I'm not sure, but I think he's trying to give some basic understanding of Budo and how it can be useful in normal life without going through like 20 years of training, just really basic concepts.
Absolutely, and that's definitely something that I think has its own value. I mean, the very basic of, at least in Koryu, I mean, the very basic elements that you're going to be training are useful. You're going to be in better shape, and in better, you're going to be more fit. And not necessarily that you're going to be able to just run a lot or, push things, that are heavy. You're going to have a better coordination. You will develop, a more flexible body. What is actually consisting of a full, full spectrum of, physical fitness. You're going to be able to achieve that. So there's definitely benefits there. There's definitely benefits on the cultural side of the school, right? And what they're going to teach you about, how to, personal composure, how to address people. And the fact that a lot of this tends to happen, at least in Koryu, in Gendai Budo, in Japan it does, sometimes it doesn't, I think it depends. But the fact that you have a very close mentorship aspect to the training, I think also helps a lot. To me, at the very least, at the beginning, that's, for the first 5 years, that's definitely what was the most useful, was to have, a Dai Senpai that was very strict with me and would catch every mistake I would make and would basically, he wouldn't punish me or anything like that, but, he would be very stern, and he would let me know, like, no, you're being an idiot right now, stop that, do it like this, do it like that. Keeping in mind also that at the beginning, again, still didn't speak Japanese, right? So at first I interpreted this the wrong way, as I'm just pissing him off because I the only thing I can do is follow his finger basically and do things. As I learned to speak Japanese, obviously I started to understand, oh no, there's a lot more to that. And that's, I think it's important to find value in what you're doing. I don't necessarily think I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with that value being implicit, at least to yourself. But yeah, I mean, if you're trying to speak to a general audience and you're trying to say, well, what is the purpose, value, and so on and so forth, yeah, there's definitely value there. Then there's obviously, the notion of self-defense. I think, that's variable depending on what you're practicing. But yeah, like, that's another subject I could go very much
into. We could actually stay in the subject and okay. Redefine self-defense with a broader meaning. It's not just physical self-defense, it's also mental self-defense, I think you can learn in Budo.
Yes.
I mean, you get much stronger in your mind, and I think it's actually much more useful than physical self-defense, because you are being attacked in some ways every day in every situation, because people have interest in getting something from you, and some people will ask nicely, some less nicely. It really depends on the situation. Of course, when you are in a nice company with nice people, it's not happening that much, but you also have customers, you also have people with needs, and you have partners, and everyone has his own interest to protect. And I really think that proper Budo training is much more efficient at teaching mental self-defense than physical self-defense.
It goes without saying. You can know all the techniques in the world and apply them at practice in perfect textbook manner. But if you don't have a certain mental toughness and a certain mental resilience, there's nothing that's going to happen there. So one presupposes the other. If you don't have a certain mental state, you will not be able to go towards self-defense. As a matter of fact, I believe that, and I'd have to ask the individual in question, but the people that are running the previous dojo that I used to train at, they're all police instructor now. One is the chief instructor, the other one was an instructor that joined on later on. And they do self-defense for women seminars. And I think that if I recall, the first thing that they do is they just sit down everyone and they tell them, this is aggression. You have to choose how you will want to respond to that. And you have to be at peace with your decision, right? Paraphrasing, I'm sure, because unfortunately I never got the chance myself to participate and or help in one of those programs. But that's what they do when you talk about self-defense, right? You will be met with, light offense to violence and aggression. And if you're mentally speaking, you're not, before and after, willing to, capable of dealing with it, then how good is it to be able to, do arm locks or, any sort of technical background? No, that's not going to be useful, right?
And how do you see your the influence of your practice in your international work environment?
Right.
Do you think that it, as you took a major position in the company, do you think that the Budo practice actually helped you in your well, I won't say in your everyday work life, but also in the strategy you had to have to make your company what it is, make the company you're working in what it is today?
I think it helped me personally go through the process. I don't think it helped on a strategic level. I started as a run-of-the-mill engineer in a company of 4 people. Now we're anywhere between 30 and 50 depending on the year. And I'm not trained as a manager. I'm not trained as administrator. I had to learn those things as I went. And I had to learn how to interact with people in different ways. So in those aspects, I think, yes, there was, being able to rely on a self that has gone through the kind of experience outside of work that made me who I am, I think, yes, it was very useful.
And would you recommend the people you're working with to practice? You talk about it at work, actually.
I used to. I stopped. And the reason for this is because I don't think nowadays all I do is I basically talk about Koryu and I do some posts about, but more from a historical aid. There's those things you can go and see. It's fun. It's interesting. But I don't go beyond that. If people have interest, I think they'll go toward that. But there's a big distance to go from, your average individual to the person who's even going to be interested in Koryu, right? And for me right now, the focus is entirely on Koryu. So, that distance, I think people have to walk themselves, right? So you can put things out there. I think you can talk about things. You can put the information that you exist out there, or that your school exist. But I don't think there's any value in trying to convince people to join.
Where would you how would you draw the line between Koryu and Gendai Budo? And I mean,
is there one?
On a very specific question.
Right.
You do Daito Ryu, I do Aikido.
Yeah.
Where do we draw the line? What is the difference between what you're doing and what I'm doing? I don't mean technically speaking. I mean as a whole, as the system.
Well, I'm certainly not the most savvy person to answer your question, but there's a few elements that to me are important that I think I've seen in pretty much all Koryu. Kata training. If you're doing free spar training and that's the main thing you're doing, I'm not sure that I would. And again,
we have kata training in Aikido. It's actually the base of
right.
Aikido.
Well, I don't know Aikido much. Again, barring two meager weeks in Yoshinkan, that's all I know about it, right? And I know that like over there they have kata, but you know, if you do judo, that's going to be a different way of training, right? If you do Kyokushin karate, it's going to be a different way of training. And again, they have kata, but is it the main thing they're doing, right?
Well,
right? Is it the main
judo,
mean
they're
of
almost not doing no kata at all?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And most people don't see, in kendo, people don't see the value of kata or iaido, and then you know they all both have each.
Yeah, but you can find actually kendo dojos in which kata is very important.
Yes.
As well as judo dojo, not that much, but some where kata is important.
Yes.
Same in karate, and it might be a little more important in aikido because you cannot actually learn aikido if you don't do kata. So that's a necessary step.
But what do you define as kata though?
Well,
because again, like no, I don't know aikido, so you're gonna have to.
No, I don't think there is much different as the meaning of kata is not much different in Koryu and in Budo. I think. I mean, the state of mind, the codified movement that must be precise, and the tension between the two protagonists. But there is one big difference in aikido is that. I think, I don't know in Daito Ryu, but I know in Kenjutsu and most Koryu it's like that, is that the uke is the senpai, and in Aikido it's the opposite. And that changes a lot.
That tells you everything you need to know, I think, about the difference, and that's maybe where it lies, is that you know, the attack has to be very specific for the transmission through kata to actually work. At least in Daito Ryu. And I would suspect, and I wouldn't go further than, even though I've done, I'm also practicing Tamieryu, but you know, most of my knowledge, or at least you know what I could perceive, I would say is mostly on the Jujutsu side. Most kata training in Jujutsu, you will be able to see, you know, as you practice, I think, or as you know watch over and over, you'll see the dynamics of attack and response. There is an actual offense, there's an actual defense, and there's you know, what if you know it goes in this direction? What is if it goes in that direction? In Daito Ryu, what I think is very specific is the timing of it. That tends to be different. But then again, you know, I'm looking from the inside to other schools on the outside. I mean, you know, there's a limit to what I obviously know of other schools, right? But there's an actual physical conflict, notion of conflict, I think, that needs to be addressed with, you know, the entirety, right? You know, timing, physicality, you know, presence of mind, and so on and so forth.
Actually, I would say that you can probably practice Aikido like a Koryu.
Maybe.
If you... I think there are some teachers actually teaching Aikido closer to Daito Ryu than most of that. And it's not a matter of groups. I mean, there are people within the Aikikai organization who actually teach the dynamic between people very differently than the Aikikai. And then I ask this question because I find more and more difficult to actually pinpoint the real difference between what Gendai Budo are outside of their sports component and Koryu Bujutsu. Or perhaps, yes, in some ways in the school you have like a strategy and like warfare strategy, and those elements are
not necessarily. I wouldn't say necessarily war, especially in Jujutsu. I don't think Jujutsu was used in a warlike
that's
context.
why I think that in the case of Katori versus Kendo, for example, I would see the difference between Budo and Bujutsu. But in the case of ancient Judo versus Kitoryu, or Aikido, some form of Aikido versus Daito Ryu, I really fail to see the difference?
Well, that brings me to, talking about actual physicality of conflict. That brings me to, I think I think what arises from that is there's going to be a desperate necessity, or at least the perception of a desperate necessity, to actually find a way to make it work, or to come to resolution, right? And I think the second point I would bring there is that there is a historical study that's required, an historical connection, which unfortunately I don't think the major Gendai Budo necessarily care to maintain. As a matter of fact, I have heard that some organization, went as far as to almost try to erase that connection to their past, instead of cultivating it. And to me, that is, if you go to any military academy, they're going to be studying military history. There's a reason for that. It's because they have, they're going to develop their minds so that they can be, especially officers, they have to be leaders. You have to set yourself up to the best way possible to win. And history is a great tool for that. And I think we spoke about this a bit over chat, but the notion of Aiki, for instance. Everyone has a different notion. Nobody knows what it is, right? The delusive Aiki. And yet it is the obsession of countless people, right? I don't understand that. I don't understand that. I understand it. I understand why it's valuable. I understand that it's a gift, but to be obsessed only on that, detached from, essentially any sort of historical reality, this is where it came from, this is how it evolved, to me is absolutely strange. And it leads to the situation today where, people talk about different things through the same words. So no actual discourse is really possible on those subjects, I think. Or at least, not without prior discussion to kind of establish the rules of engagement in terms of, how you're going to debate something.
We make videos, we make interviews, we publish things. You would ask me to do something about Aiki, I would say no, no way. It's going to be a huge mess with hundreds of people telling their own opinions, and it would be
First you need to log the comments on YouTube. That's the first thing you're going to have to do.
would be impossible. But you're right. I really think you're correct. No one really has a clear idea of what it is. It hasn't been researched enough, and way too often put out of context. I mean, Aiki for Ueshiba was certainly not the same thing as it was for Takeda or probably Kondo Sensei.
I think what happened is that there's been in the context of Aikido, I get the impression there's been there's kind of a deification of Ueshiba Sensei. And so he must know. The path he laid out must be perfect. Everybody's human.
He was the worst teacher ever, so...
Everybody's human. Besides, I've heard stories of him walking around and just telling every individual, I'm going to teach you the right thing. No, everybody else, no, but you, I'm going to teach you the right thing.
Or getting incredibly mad on the mats and then hitting the floor and walls. And then, I mean, it's something we discussed with Guillaume once. I think that the beauty of Aikido, the real sense of Aikido, is that Ueshiba started from point A and then ended up point B higher in someone's state of, in his own state of mind, and he became a better person. And if you imagine that the guy was a god, you deny him the right to get better, to have evolved from...
Yeah, he's never failed. And therefore, as an individual who practices, neither can you.
And exactly.
That's silly.
So if you believe Ueshiba is a god, then Aikido is irrelevant to the humans.
It brings up a second point, I think, going a little bit back to your question about Koryu. That sets up a target and it sets up an unhealthy target. If you take the life and times, as I've studied a bit of Ueshiba Sensei, if you take this as a case study, this is, like you said, he went from point A and point B, and he was remarkable in his level of accomplishment. Then that is interesting. I think there is something to learn. I think for Daito Ryu practitioner, there is some historical value to that, right?
Well, he was a Daito Ryu practitioner who came, moved forward to a different path. But
yes.
It's obviously it must be interesting for Daito Ryu to study Ueshiba.
Yes. Well, to me, it's a side study, again, for historical purposes, because there's so many other people that you can go and study. But it is interesting. But again, yes, you have to recognize that people are flawed, and that decisions that might have been made must have been flawed sometimes. But also, and that reminds me of there's 2 ex-colleagues at the company who are practicing internal power stuff. And they were adamant that I would go and try with them. And I practiced, and I had research individual. Apparently, he had practiced some Daito Ryu, some Yagyu Shinganyu, I think, as well. But what he was teaching was completely different. Like it was a very modernized kind of practice. So I did the practice. It was very interesting. Clearly, as an individual, he's very good at what he's doing. He has he's internalized a very important concept. And when we finished, my two ex-colleagues asked me, "So, what do you think?" I told them, "I think you should study Koryu if you want to get there." It's important to look beyond your teacher, and that's one of the notion about like the whole historical background and being able to dig into history that I think is important, and that perhaps defines Koryu from Gendai Budo, is that unless you do that, you're not, I think, allowing yourself to view your teachers as a whole, as as saintly as they might be today. Were they always like that? Probably not. And that will give you clues into how you can actually find your own way in your practice.
And that's something I always found quite worrying about some teachers, is that when a teacher starts saying, I went all the way, and now I know, so I'm going to teach you the truth. How do you teach the results of your training if we don't train? I mean, don't we all have, maybe you found a few shortcuts in the way, but yet we have to do the training if you
don't know if
those
you don't know if those shortcuts can be generalized unless you spend time on that. You don't know if where you arrived is the same place everybody else should arrive, because in Koryu there's a lot of variety. You go see, in Tamiyaryu, I was practicing under a teacher who was one of the pupils of Tsumaki Sensei, the father, right? His name is school the Gen Yukai, because he wanted to teach a real thing. You go see other people that practice Tamiyaryu. They will practice very differently. Right? It's all the same kata. And even my teacher would say, like, well, you can do it like this, you can do it like that. Right? Those are, the ways you can practice it, and you're kind of going to get the same lessons. Well, at least that's how I understood it. There is no absolutism in Koryu, I think. Maybe, at the core. There must be, perhaps. But that's, as hard as formal and hard as the kata might seem, I think they're really like that just when you get started, because you don't know where you're going, so you need a straight line. You need a line to walk.
Well, yeah.
But at some point, you're just gonna, you're gonna grow into that, and you're gonna be able to adjust, and you're gonna be able to adjust to different partners, different situations, circumstances. Oh, maybe it could be applied in such and such kind of situation, or maybe it could mean such and such things. And maybe both are true. And that's another thing. Maybe both have value, but maybe there's only one that's really about the school. Maybe there's only one of those lessons that you saw there that's will lead you in, when you bring everything as a whole, is actually going to bring you to, oh, that's the big lesson in that school. Those are the big kind of the crux of what's being studied and passed on.
I agree with you, but I think it would be quite funny to make a study of how many groups or Ryuha have in the name the sense of truth. We have the true version of the art. It's in Japanese history. It's incredible to see how many times sometimes you just have the name of the guy, and I think that's fine, and that's probably the best way of doing it. But this Shin Makoto truth thing everywhere in the dojo names and the school names and everywhere, and I'm wondering if.
But perhaps that translation is more about saying that the teaching is true, not that that school is, Well,
you would have to separate both, yeah.
No, but I know what you're trying to get to, that there is a certain amount of ego sometimes that can be perceived throughout.
Especially, as a long-term resident in Japan, I understand that Japanese have a huge ego like anyone else. It's not bigger nor smaller. But in the West, we tend to think that Asians, and especially Japanese, have a small ego, And I really don't think it's true. It's just the same as...
That's confusing politeness with actual intent, right? I think that's probably accurate. Like these days I feel so removed from the West that like sometimes I caution myself, because I don't know how things have been going the last 10 years to a large degree. The few times I would go abroad was basically to do translation with Kondo Sensei or to visit my family or business trips. And most of those trips were short in nature.
Still you can see on internet all those Ryuha popping out in Europe or North America.
Well, Ryuha popping up in the West.
Not Ryuha, but fake, strange groups, and
let's call it dubious origins.
But sometimes it's encouraged by Japanese actually. So what I want to say is, he is Koryu really effective at doing what it's trying to do. When you see finally
what is it trying to do?
Bettering people in some ways. They will teach you that you must control your ego and be respectful and whatever value they put in it. But in average, do they really respect their own values? Of course, many teachers do. But what I want to say is the existence of Budo and Koryu in Japan makes Japan better as a whole, and it doesn't really seem so to me.
Well,
Ueshiba said that Budo would be for the betterment of the world, but did the world get any better because of Aikido? Obviously not. And what about Budo in general in Japan?
I think it did. But then again, if we're strictly speaking about Japan, Japan, and it kind of goes back to the whole self-defense thing. They still have the how do you call it? The forks that they use for controlling aggressors. They still have those in schools, right?
Yeah, they have those in schools. Yeah.
How do you call it?
I don't remember. They have one at school. It's super funny because, Japan is probably the only country that can use that.
Yes, if you in the event of having an aggressor running amok in the school, the students are going to take care of you. More or less. This is a funny concept, but regardless of whether you think it's sufficient or not, or that it would have any efficacy in a real life event, I think it creates a certain mindset, which can be cultivated through Budo. Some people decide to, some others don't. Just like in the West, I think younger people tend to not develop a certain interest in old things because they're not as shiny anymore, or at least not as shiny as the brand new thing. But that's where I think perhaps Koryu could get better. Is more the historical element, saying like there's an actual value here. There is probably a popularization effort that could be done, which is actually something I'm kind of personally looking into, trying to kind of talk about. Not necessarily, I don't want to say teach because I'm not there yet, but talk about Koryu without talking about Koryu, talking about those notions without necessarily referring to the sort of insider baseball language, Japanese language that you need to know to be able to just kind of talk about those things, right? So just make it plain. I think I think some people have done that, and I think they've done it relatively well. If that could reach a broader audience, I think it might actually achieve its goal. However, I think the naive idea that just like it's peace for the sake of peace is silly. The fact that people have ego is just something that is, and there's nothing you can do about that. Not rewind that for a moment. People have their ego, and what you can do about it is just deal with it, right? You can't, if there weren't any conflict, there wouldn't be any Koryu, there wouldn't be any Budo. And, if people have ego, eventually that's going to create conflict. The way those conflicts are being handled and managed, I think, is where you can judge whether Budo Koryu is having an impact, and a positive one or a negative one in the world. I would personally think that it's mostly positive, and that the negative elements that sometimes we perceive would be there nevertheless. And so it's just, it's not a creation of our own. It's basically, it would be there in a different form, even if Budo didn't exist.
Yeah. So that was kind of my point. That's Budo is, after all, I don't want to say like sports. That would be
what are you trying to win?
Misinterpretation. Yeah,
what are you trying to win?
But in some way, you have a tool to solve a situation or fix something, and that's something that you don't have exclusively on Budo. You have that in, like art, music, painting, maybe, or whatever. I mean, I can imagine that many musicians are trying to inspire people in a way that would make them more sensitive to certain things, which is not that much different than what we're doing in Budo when we're trying to be more sensitive to other people in order to better solve the situations, the conflicts. So I would like move a little bit on the next topic. Could be somewhat Bunburu Yodo. I from two different perspectives.
Yeah.
What people think it is, and what it actually is. But I think sometimes it's even more interesting to discuss about what people think it is, because it tells more about the world than the actual concept.
I think it tells a lot about the seriousness of your practice when you get a term like that so wrong that it doesn't even talk about literature anymore. My understanding is that traditionally it meant making sure that you would study Taoist, Confucianist text, the classics basically, right? And that through that you would develop the mind. As modern Koryu practitioner, I think we have also the responsibility of going through the mountain of material that was written in the relatively peaceful era, and study that as well, right? So that's my interpretation of it. I fully acknowledge that it's probably a step aside from the traditional interpretation. But, you know, like I told you before the interview, I've seen people refer to Bunbun Ryodo as, oh, I'm also doing yoga. It's like, I think, you know, there's a lot to talk about here.
Yeah.
But again, you know, people do what they do, and that's fine. You engage with people that are serious. I don't think there's any point in trying to convince those who are not, right? On open forums, perhaps to leave a track record of your thought process. If somebody leaves something you feel you can craft a response to that a third party might actually find value into, which might bring that person to contact you or, you know, develop a new relationship, then yeah, great, you can do that. But, you know, a lot of the interactions you can have are not necessarily about convincing people, just because it's, you know, it's generally not in your own interest anyway. It's not what you're trying to do.
But you would say from your own perspective that studying Budo, whatever Gendai Budo, provided that it is not a sport, but a Budo or Kobudo, Koryu, without studying either classics or at least, I would say, philosophy or, well, things that are...
study your school.
Your school, of course.
I mean, you don't have to go very far. Like, that's the, you know, you have a history that left a tradition which still lives today in the practice. Well, you know, if you only care about the practice, I think that's okay.
But you're not a true Budoka.
I don't know if there's a true Budoka.
You're missing something.
I think there's some people that are very well established through their practice. I think it's easier to become well-rounded if you use all the tools that are in the toolbox, right? Not everyone needs them. You know, there's always those genius type of people that they just get it, right? And, you know, maybe they don't, you know, you're still going to be exposed to some of the history and tradition anyway, just through the practice naturally. So it's not like if you're going to be entirely ignorant. So you're still going to, you know, even inadvertently, you know, tap into that toolbox, but you don't necessarily need to actively study it. I personally think it adds a lot. I personally think that it's very hard to really, and it kind of goes into the role that you have as a long-time practitioner in the school, which I'm not yet, but, you know, I'm practicing with people that have been there for 40 years. You know, you become part of that tradition and the history, and you're going to have to make sure that you can pass it down. One of the reasons why I decided to stay permanently in Japan is because I saw a need for that in the school, for someone to stick around and help, you know, pass down the tradition to hopefully other Japanese people, hopefully maybe other willing, you know, diligent foreigners.
That could be actually one of the points that separates Koryu from Gendai Budo. In the sense, I've heard many very well established and excellent teachers of various arts, including Aikido and including people I do respect a lot, saying that while studying Japanese history is not useful. It's you don't need it to practice. And, well, they know that my opinion is different, so I can't say it, but I really think they're wrong. I think if you really want to take the Budo as a whole, if you want to take everything from it, everything it has to offer, you can't just do the technique. And it's not necessarily Japanese culture, I think. I really think that, well, if you take Aikido, for instance, you have Ueshiba, and Ueshiba was talking religion all the time. And even with years of studies, I wasn't able to really fully understand what he was trying to say. So it might be a little too complicated or not that much useful, I think. But studying Confucianism or even religion in from the philosophical perspective, classic philosophy, like Platon, Socrates, and those people, I think it really gives you perspective in what you're doing, in your life in general, but if you're practicing lots of Budo, it's giving you perspective in your Budo practice. And without that, it seems to me that people are just empty shells. You know, they're just doing techniques and it's not leading anywhere.
Well, you don't know what their life path includes. Maybe they have life experiences that
of course,
crystallize the very same lessons that books have crystallized for you, right?
Yeah, but you cannot really say that you don't need it. You know, that the technique is enough.
Again, you need something. I think I wouldn't say that there's an ultimate tool, right? And again, people have different paths. Now, again, in the context of Aikido, I wouldn't necessarily know if history is required or relevant. How it would contextualize the modern practice. When you're talking about, say, weapons training, or like Nihon Eiho, right? A good example. It's like, well, it was used for, Nihon Eiho, right? And my understanding is it was used for infiltration and exfiltration and, ship maintenance, that kind of things, right? Well, what kind of ships did you maintain? Must be an interesting question in that context. If you're doing weapons training, this is one of the great subjects of conversation I have with fellow practitioners of other schools. Unless you can actually visualize what the art was practiced for, it's very hard to unless you can figure out what the pinpoint the actual historical use and role of what you're practicing was. I think it must be very hard to contextualize that, right? So in the context of Koryu, I think you need to have some notion of that even just like in terms of instinct, right? And that's why I'm saying, like, some people just have that instinct. They don't necessarily know the history, but they'll understand the context naturally. They're just going to get it. But yeah, for instance, like the whole sword, you have swords in the battlefield and so on and so forth. It's very little indication of that, except for the cavalry.
I mean, if you do Iaido and you don't study the context and you're just throwing your sword and cutting your sword back, you could do that with a stick, with a brush or whatever. I mean, it's yes. There's nothing specific to Budo. It's not really Budo. It's just using a tool. Maybe it brings peace to people like yoga or whatever, but it's not Budo. It's empty.
If you practice Budo to bring peace only to yourself, I think I would argue
kind
that
of missing the point.
yes, to put it in short terms, yes. There's a sentence that I'm going to paraphrase from the Hagakure that Yamamoto Tsuneto wrote. That it's something to the effect that in your meditation you should always imagine yourself essentially on the losing end, being pierced by lances, cut by swords, drowning, and so on and so forth, right? To fully understand, to be of full use to your master. And to me, it's understanding context. And so if you want to understand practice, you need to understand. You have to have some understanding of the context, I think. I'm sure you could find other people to disagree with that. I'm sure there's a good argument on the other side of that subject, but to me it seems something rather important. I mean, especially if we're talking about just the matter of preservation again, if there's something to preserve, maybe we should understand it from a vector standpoint and not from just the mere point we're at right now where things are standing and then move to the next increment.
Well, say it other way, in other terms, if you don't know where you're coming from, you don't know where you're heading.
Sure. You mentioned Socrates quickly. I think if I had to trace where, interestingly enough, Koryu started for me, it actually was in Socrates. I had a philosophy teacher that wrote a dissertation on the notion that, which actually I just bought it back and I'm getting it shipped from Canada, so I'm probably not going to get it until February. But he wrote a book called Socrates, Wise Man and Warrior. And it's basically the notion that his days of wars have not only shaped his methodology in philosophy, but also his character, his moral. The way, he decided that he would allow himself to die for democracy, essentially, valuing, the whole more than the few. I think if I had to trace it, I just bought back the book because I really want to, get back into more of the details that were in there. I haven't read it for 20 years now, I think. But there is, absolutely. I mean, I think you can find, it's not that you cannot find the notions that are in Koryu in Japan in any other places. I think that'd be silly to think that. What I do think, though, is that Koryu crystallizes so many of those lessons in one place. And I think that is the rather unique portion of it, is that there's this long-standing tradition of teaching, military policing matters that has formed in all those little schools and then in bigger schools sometimes. That is rather unique, right?
Yeah, there is much more in Koryu in that sense that there is in Budo. If you in Gendai Budo, if you take Gendai Budo as something that was created in the 20th century with like cutting ties with their ancestors. But sometimes I wonder if the ties were cut for good or bad reasons. I mean, in the case of Judo, it was because they just wanted, because there was a complicated relationship between Kano and the government, and to put, and the context was that it was difficult to put samurai arts in schools. So he cut everything and he created Judo and he put that in education. At least there is something left, sure. Not that much, but a little left in Judo of the past. And all Budo has its very specific history. I mean, if karate, which was not really considered as Budo by Japanese until after the World War II.
Until it became useful.
Until it became sellable, I would say.
Well, basically the story goes, it was at Motobu that basically, just punched out some foreigners in like a duel, and like nobody knew what it was, and they figured out, oh, that's our answer to boxing. Like basically the Butokai at the time said like, oh, that's our answer to boxing. We're gonna bring them in.
Yeah, but
there was some story like that apparently.
Yeah, it's clearly that it became officially Japanese when it became useful, not as a martial art, but as a tool for communication, propaganda, or whatever. And you have Aikido, and it's a pretty specific story, especially because it's one of the youngest Budo. Maybe Aikido has easier connections with the past thanks to Daito Ryu, although we don't really know exactly, apart from Daito Ryu, what's in Aikido. We know that there's Daito Ryu in it, but maybe more, and no one really agrees. But looking for those, the history of each art, I think is really, well, personally, I find this interesting. But I'm not sure, in the case of Budo, I'm not sure it's completely relevant to practice itself. I think people would rather go search for answers in what they are more familiar with, like in some cases religion, in some cases Western philosophy. I think it's probably enough to reflect on your own practice in Gendai Budo. Although I find on the personal level very interesting to look at history.
So Judo, I think, served a very different purpose. It's serving today the purpose I think Mr. Kano had in mind. It was an education tool, and as an educational tool, Judo took essentially notions of Koryu and
It was also a communication tool for Japan to the world, and it's achieving that in the Olympics.
As part of their soft power projection. Yes, that achieves the tool. So in that sense, I think that's perfectly fine. I suspect that there was also, just like during the Meiji Restoration, a need for training a mass police force, and I suspect that judo actually contributed in those efforts. I'm not knowledgeable enough on the subject to be able to assert this with certainty, but I get the impression that this must have been a contributing factor. Fun fact, there's apparently some records that show that Daito Ryu, the Admiral Takeshita basically wanted to introduce Daito Ryu to the army, to the military, right? So there was also, there was a lot of different...
That's through Ueshiba because they were close.
I don't know yet. It's still one of the threads I'm pulling on right now.
Because some people say, Aikido is fantastic. Ueshiba was incredible because Ueshiba taught to the army. No, Ueshiba taught to the army because he was friend with
he was friend with the military. He was friend with at least a number of admirals.
Could have been Kano or whomever.
Yeah.
Just the how it happens, but it's not because Ueshiba was especially extraordinary.
But that's the other thing about the from a Daito Ryu perspective, with the notion that Ueshiba was this almighty god of Aiki, which as far as history goes, perhaps he was, right? But what I think it has as a negative effect is that it actually overshadows a lot of historical relevant people like Asano Sekio, Takeshita Isamu, Hisatakuma, for instance, to name a few. Yeah. Even Takedo Tokumine was overshadowed by all of that, I would suspect. Even Sokaku Sensei himself, to a large degree, got overshadowed.
It looks like so, because people say, Ueshiba learned from Sokaku, who was genius samurai, but let's not talk too much about the guy, because actually he doesn't fit with the Aikido.
Yes, because by all accounts, he was a pretty rough person, right? I think the most relevant part of Sokaku Sensei's what we know of him is that he was insightful. He had a very strong sense of perception. Was able, a lot of the stories are about. And again, you have different lineage at this point. Some lineage seems to focus on some stories. Some others don't even talk about any of those stories. But from what Takedo Tokumine Sensei was recounting, he had an amazing power of perception. He was able to perceive, kind of Sherlock Holmes kind of thing, knowing that people were from this and that background and so on and so forth, right? He was also somebody who was known to walk around with, a tanto, unsheeted tanto. It actually was sheeted and wrapped in paper, apparently, on his stomach, just to be ready.
Well,
at all time.
Even if you put in the context, I would say, in Hokkaido, for example, at the time, I would understand that people would travel around even with swords, even if it was forbidden, because it was really the far west of Japan. But in Tokyo, you wouldn't.
No, but then again, like if you come from Hokkaido and you're pulled to Tokyo, you might actually bring on your old habits, right? Mm-hmm. So, those are all, telling stories that I think, they unfortunately, I would suppose if you're coming from an Aikido background, you don't necessarily, have easy exposure to. And I mention this right now because while I'm not from an Aikido background at all, the majority of Daito Ryu practitioner appear to be from Aikido background.
Kind of a revenge, right? Because Daito Ryu was overshadowed by Aikido for decades, and now people coming to Daito Ryu are coming from Aikido. So
yes, because I think people have different motivations, right? Some people come, at least speaking for mainline Daito Ryu under Kondo Sensei, Some people come from for the efficacy, right? Perceived efficacy of
perceived
the technique.
most of the time.
We'll get back to that. So others basically come because they actually the notion of Aikido they perceive is closer to what they believe to be the real thing. There's a variety of reasons why people come from Aikido. And as you say, Aikido is not one thing. So it's my guess is that if there's any usefulness there is there's a stepping stone. And to be fair, I mean I know a lot of people that went from Aikido and they went to other Koryu as well, right, and developed wonderfully there. It's worth mentioning maybe also one last thing about that the Aikido today, from what I've been told by some of my senpai, is if you go back even to the 60s, according to them, Aikido was pretty much Daito Ryu. Something happened in the 70s after Ueshiba Sensei's passing.
Well, actually, I think that you can.
That's what I suspect, but
yeah, I think so. But I think you can also see in some people, even at the Hombu Dojo. I don't know if there will still be in 10 or 20 years, but even right now, I know one or two teachers who are doing techniques that very much look like from the outside Daito Ryu. It to an untrained eye, it would look like Aikido, like would look the same as any other teacher.
Yeah.
But when you see the hips moving, the way they're using their body, the way some of the teachers do their Ikkyo, Iliminage, they have this body mechanic that doesn't look like what the Dojo is doing. So actually what is official Aikido now, it looks like a more ancient way of moving, actually. It's less sportive way of moving. They don't really cross hips. They're using one profile and the translation movements. I don't know Daito Ryu much more than what Guillaume showed a few times or the videos I've seen or the demonstrations. But after 20 years in Aikido, I would say that those teachers are not really doing the official Aikido. They're doing something else. And I suspect it's closer to Daito Ryu than what the other teachers are doing. But I'm afraid that it's slightly, slowly disappearing. Those teachers are not the most popular.
Well, if you extrapolate from what I think happened there, or if you just even if you have a different view, if you extrapolate from that, I mean, the people who trained under a student of Ueshiba Sensei who practiced Daito, who actually, at a time where perhaps it was closer to his peak condition, was doing a practice closer to Daito Ryu. Those people must be becoming fewer and fewer. So maybe those are students of students of students.
Yeah, well,
so
I think it's not really a very good thing for Aikido to be that disconnected from Daito Ryu. If you take the perspective that Ueshiba was pretty much doing things that were very close to Daito Ryu, and it's becoming, I think, I'm afraid, so more sportive Aikido. This way of crossing hips, developing power in a more easily. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks like, to me, it looks like Daito Ryu, as many other Koryu, take time to not just to learn the kata, but to forge, build the body in order to be able to apply the techniques.
Yes.
And I have this feeling that people want to get a quicker thing in Aikido, so they want to be able to do the technique in like 2-3 years, and in order to do that, they have to do something that is more aligned with modern sports. So they can use strengths, but it changes the mechanics. So it changes the art and the techniques.
If you use strength in Daito Ryu, when applied correctly, people are going to get hurt. So that's one thing. And that would be true of any serious Koryu Jujutsu, I believe. The notion, like the reason why it's turning into a sport, as you're saying, then perhaps is because there was a void of purpose. I don't know. There is the sense maybe that if you establish a clear purpose that's still connected to a warlike vision of practice, right? Physical conflict, policing, whatnot. That it's gonna when transmitted at scale, it's gonna transmit the wrong thing, right? There's gonna be a large clique of people that are gonna get the wrong lessons, and perhaps very dangerous lessons from that. So that's one thing. Second, for Koryu to work, again, the apprenticeship is extremely important, which means you generally not going to find very large groups, or if you find large groups, it's going to be very fragmented in the sense that you might have one person supervising 6 people at a time. And you're going to need people with the right level of seniority to make that really work generally.
To teach to more people, you need to simplify the teachings.
So if it turns, if it turns into a sport, who knows? Maybe there's going to be some value to that. I personally think some lessons are being lost. Perhaps those lessons are not for everyone, and perhaps that's for the best. We'll see.
Well, one of the good things in most Budo and especially in Aikido is that you have many views, many different teachers, many groups doing different things.
You have that in Koryu as well. I mean,
yes, but
I have like 3 of the most senior people that I have. They all have very different lessons to teach, and they teach all very different lessons. But it's all Daito Ryu. It's all on the same backbone. You need, in my humble opinion, if you want to call it a martial practice. I don't really like the word martial arts personally. Sometimes I just end up using it. But if you want to have a serious martial practice, I mean, there needs to be, a core to it that, we can all agree to, because, martial practice implies that even if you are not practicing for going to, a conflict zone or, to work as a police officer and whatnot, it's still rooted into physical conflict. What you're doing is a representation of an abstract form of physical conflict, right? An abstracted conflict situation, let's say, right? It's so unless you practice with that in mind, well, you can study history and it's like not studying history. There's something missing, quite likely, right? So that it turns into a sport. I mean, there's also a big movement for Taido right now, apparently. If it gets people to be fit and healthy, hey, it's good. I am concerned that people are going to think that it's a fighting art, that it's a fighting practice. And even if it is, I would suggest that practicing it, so I need to be specific, I feel here, but if you're practicing judo with the police academy, you're not practicing everybody else's judo, right? If you're practicing Taido or Aikido or other practices that do under a lineage that does not have that notion built in, but you practice it with that in mind, with that notion of conflict in mind, nevertheless, you're going to get hurt. You're going to get other people hurt. You might create situations that are going to be very hard to diffuse.
Well, you're actually achieving the opposite of what you were looking for in the first place.
Yeah, I think the ideal of Aikido, from what I understand, to strive toward peace is absolutely, commendable. It's one that I believe most, if not all, Koryu Ryuha share.
Yeah, but it's an ideal.
The difference that I perceive from the outside is that there's not an ignorance or nobody's putting the blinder on their eyes about the fact that there is violence, that there is conflict, and that it's not necessarily going to come in the form that you want. That developing a certain level of readiness at a personal level, means going into uncomfortable situation, means developing a certain kind of mindset and body.
Well, I think Aikido is quite complicated, and I'm not even sure that that Ueshiba's philosophy holds. I mean, it would require to be put under scrutiny of seasoned, well-educated philosophers to see if it actually...
You're talking about consistency, right?
Yeah, consistency and the ideal. I fear that it might just not even be possible. It might be illogical from it might be just a fallacy. I mean, the idea is basically to bring peace to the world by educating every single person. I mean, you cannot achieve peace through Aikido ideals by applying Aikido in context. Everyone has to accept to let go the conflict so it can work. And it's a beautiful ideal, but it's utopic. It's just not possible. It's negating the human nature to believe that there will be, if everyone on earth practices Aikido, then you can achieve peace. I mean, it's kind of silly to say.
Well, you're going to have everyone,
If you say it this way, it's kind of strange. So I don't know, but I think that in 70 years, 60 years since the passing of the founder, Aikido hasn't really been put under much philosophical studies. And I think it's a pity because people have claims. So if they want to back up their claims, they have to study if what they're claiming, if what the founder was claiming was actually, thought it stand.
This is where the cultural disconnect basically kind of puts you into a conundrum, I think, in Aikido, or at least from what you're describing. I wouldn't put any Koryu under the scrutiny of a philosopher, especially the modern ones. But the lessons to be learned are no less valuable. They're cultural lessons.
The problem is not the lessons, it's the claims people have. I mean, in Koryu, you barely hear people talking about higher ideals.
Yeah, but because people don't really care about those claims. It's not about it's not about going toward esoteric elements. And even those who actually do go towards more esoteric elements, those who do seriously will come back with a very pragmatic view of things. There's no flaming God in the sky. No, these are symbols. Those symbols were meant to convey a certain idea, right? It's a language. And that was just like Koryu, combined with the practice, would, be meant for developing individual to serve a certain purpose. If you're a priest, maybe it's, helping people deal with, the death of a close relative, or deal with the concept of death itself. If you're, I don't have any other example right now, but unless you can find pragmatism, I think that's the pragmatism and realism, right? If you can't find this in your practice, then there's probably either something missing in that practice,
or a fallacy somewhere in the reasoning.
Or either what I was about to say is either there's something missing in the practice, or maybe
I mean,
I'll stop there. But
maybe what people claim is just a fallacy. They should go back to a more pragmatic claims, and that would be. I mean, if you can't back up what you're saying by your practice, you have two ways to solve the problem. You can improve your practice and back up your claims, or you can change your claims to lower them a little. You can work on both ends of the spectrum.
Again, like I don't know what those claims are, so I'm trying to go with generalities here. But yeah, if I think it's a if you disconnect from the history, then all your claims becomes highly rational, in need of high rationalization. Tradition will, while rooted in pragmatism, sometimes you're going to be told something that's counterintuitive just happens to be true. And there's historical relevant. There's a TED talk about the breadth of wisdom that's being lost in the last few Aboriginal tribes that exist in the world, where they would be able to know what plant is just by looking at it through a full moon, right? Whereas a botanist today would, even a very good one, would not be able to make the difference. There doesn't make sense that this would be the way in a Western mindset to identify a plant, but for them it worked and it helped them survive, right? That's tradition, right? So I'm trying to basically really draw a line between it needs to be rational and holding to a true philosophical standard as the philosophy tradition exists, like from Socrates, and well, it still needs to serve a purpose. It still needs to be rooted in the real in that sense, right? From what you're describing, if there's a disconnect from history, from tradition, then how do you justify your practice, right? And maybe that's what's happening right now in Aikido from what you're describing.
I think it's happening in other arts as well.
Would you say that it's happening in Judo?
It's happened in Judo, although...
Happened or happening?
Happened, I think. Still happening a little, but well, it's largely disconnected from its origins. And people are today making claims of what Judo is, and it's obviously it's not.
Well, you're always going to have some people are going to make some claim about what something is.
Well, you have the same in karate. You have the same everywhere. I'm afraid it may have. This is where I connect the question with your concept of tradition. It may have a connection with the 21st century modern way of neglecting the tradition and believing that everything should be efficient right now at this moment. And I have this feeling that it's very hard to get young people interested in traditions nowadays. Much more difficult than it used to be maybe a few decades ago. And for this reason, it might actually be the reason why the memberships in Kobudo as a whole is quite terrible right now. And then many are going to disappear in the next decades.
Kitoryu is a good example if we're talking about Judo.
And the thing would be, how do we convince people now that the connection with tradition is actually going to be useful for them in the modern world? I think it is. I'm convinced. But how do we convince others?
You have to go back to that notion of pragmatism. My theory of that case is that if we can find a way to talk about to talk on subjects that are relevant to Koryu in terms of like conflict, physical conflict or de-escalation or Reigi, other traditions, dealing with the notion of death. For some schools seems to be important, for instance. If we can talk about those on relevant topics and talk about it with the wisdom of the tradition, I think people might actually start to ask, that's interesting, how did you develop that thought? How did you develop that way of seeing things? Well, I happen to be doing this. This thing is called Koryu, right? If you're trying to convince people to practice Koryu, you don't even know where to get started. It's just so much. It's a whole world, right? I wasn't convinced of practicing Koryu, right? I just fell into it. So you were saying much earlier, how lucky I was. That's an understatement, to say the least. I fell into it, and only a few years later, it's like, oh, that's what it is, right? It's the realization that actually comes to you. But trying to convince people, I know there's a lot of foreign dojos that have a very hard time with that. They're trying to sell it as self-defense and so on and so forth. Self-defense is strange to me for Jujutsu. I don't think that was the purpose. It's an inevitable outcome that you'll be able to handle yourself. The purpose of learning Jujutsu was to, seemingly to do some policing work, dealing with ruffians in the streets, maintaining order, it seems. If you see it in that perspective first, I think you'll think differently of your practice, I think, right? Suppose I have to, deal with this, not because I need to protect myself, but let's make it a case that's, perhaps easier to understand. Maybe I need to protect my daughter, who's right next to me, right? Or maybe I need to just there's people around and this guy's going, crazy. Think about it this way instead, right? You have an interest in that, fine, and you want to make it useful, okay. Maybe seeing it from a self-defense perspective is not the best way. Now you'll get that, if you by proxy. But I think that frame of thought is a lot more relevant and more historically connected potentially, or at least it seems, I would say, to how it was developed, and therefore you would arguably be closer to the true practice of the tradition by following that approach.
Well, when you say self-defense, it also means self-centered, and things that are self-centered tend to work better in the 21st century.
It always did. I mean, I think the megaphone that was given through the internet is what makes it seemingly worse. But I mean, people have always been self-interested. It's no different. Maybe the echo chamber effect makes that it's developing as its own thing. I don't know, but
I have this feeling that it's getting worse.
Maybe.
And through internet and social networks, I believe. I mean, we are defined by how others are seeing us. So when you increase the number of people seeing you, then the greater the responsibility you have to define yourself, and it becomes really heavy to handle, I think.
Well, I mean, I think it's just tribal effects, right? You find people that think already like you, and then you stick with them, and you need an enemy, you need the other, right? Well, collaboration can be a great way to develop as well, right? It's just that, so sometimes people don't seem to find any common ground anymore, to even stand on.
I heard once a speech by Tim Minchin. He's an Australian artist, and he said, stop defining yourself in opposition to things. Some define yourself saying, I don't like this music, I don't like these people, I don't like this politician. Say, I like this. Define yourself positively, not against things.
Sure.
And I think it's something that nowadays politicians but powerful people have used for millennia to control people. It's easier to control people who they find in opposition. And people are continuing doing this maybe because they were formatted thinking this way on social networks and everything. But it's so much easier to say, I like this. I do I do Aikido because I don't like Judo. What? Some people say that, no, I do Aikido because I like Aikido. That's it. I mean,
well,
there's no need to fight again.
There's a notion of eloquence there. I think maybe people are they're not expressing themselves in the most cognate way, or at least they're not expressing their ideas in the most cognate way, and that sometimes it just comes out like that. If you practice any serious Koryu, I suspect you will, it's going to introduce you to a world of change. And in the case of at least Daito Ryu, a world of pain. Not because people are going to hurt you, but as you mentioned, you need to develop the body, and the body development that's done in Daito Ryu, at least in mainline, is quite demanding. You'd have a lot of foreign students coming for a few weeks, having a hard time to keep up sometimes. And at some point, if you do it seriously, you're going to have to ask yourself, why the hell do I do this? And you don't need to answer that question. It's not the point. Because the answer always ultimately is self-interest. The point I'm trying to make here is that if you do not have a well-defined self-interest notion of what you do, are, and will are wishing to protect and defend and cultivate, if you don't have that, you're gonna have a harder time with that question. You'll find tons of answers, but they're never gonna feel satisfying, right? So at some point, you'll be faced with the choice of defining your self-interest and applying, what you've developed into in a pragmatic way, or just go do something else that will get you there, right? Or quit, I guess, but that wouldn't be very useful, wouldn't it?
Well, sometimes it's a good advice to, when you're on the wrong path and you realize it's. Many people have a hard time making the decision to quit or to change path, but sometimes it's the only way. So
you only have one path. It's the one that your feet go. This is the one forward in front of you, right? If you end up changing dojo, or if you end up changing practice, you could go from Koryu to Nihon Budo for all I care. You're following your path, right? And that's why the notion of self-interest is really important. People feel that it's easy to say, I'm changing paths. It's like, no, you are changing. Be aware, be mindful of your evolution, because it will define your self-interest, and vice versa.
You mean there? It actually means that you're never making any mistakes. You're just learning and getting bigger and bigger. And what you are now is the result of what you lived until that point. So
all your mistakes are in the past. What's in front of you is decisions, right? You cannot preemptively make a mistake. You can just prepare yourself to not make one.
Or you can be too afraid to make decisions, so you never take any. But that's probably,
which arguably is a mistake of its own.
But that's maybe something we have to face in Budo more often than people think. I think even technically speaking, we see people having a hard time making decisions, and I think that's that's a whole another topic that would probably take a lot of time. But the process of decision making inside the practice is probably also an interesting point to explore.
I think it's relatively straightforward, though. I mean, if you stick to principles, of decency, deference to your teacher, deference to your senpai. Generally, the road ahead of you is pretty clear. You might have doubt about it, but that's where you either stick with it or you don't, right? But which I think is what you're trying to get with like, no, do I stay on the path, right?
Yeah.
But at least in Koryu, that's really not much of a question, because the teachers are not defining the school as much as Ueshiba Sensei seems to define it. I mean, the school defines itself, right? And the senpai are as essential to the Ryuha as as the top teacher.
Well, that's a problem that might be quite specific to Aikido, actually. Because if you take Judo, I mean, it's not... Judo is defined because it's Judo. It's not defined by Kano. Actually, Kano was not even a very good Koryu practitioner himself, so...
I wouldn't know.
But he created Judo was 22, so...
Right.
I mean, couldn't have been like a Ueshiba just for the difference of training time, I mean. So Judo is an art in itself. Aikido, I think it's not... maybe it will become something of itself, but it doesn't look like so at the time.
For what it's worth, the last 2 years, the Shinnenkai, the Kobudo Shinkokai, Ueshiba, Moriteru is Mr. Moriteru is basically showing up as a guest of honor. So I don't know if there's something going on there.
Yeah,
it's mind of respect.
It looks like Aikido, he's in between two chairs. I'm a Budo, but I want to be a Koryu a little, and you have a little of both.
Don't you find it for something that's defined as a martial practice? Don't you find it mildly odd that the organization being indecisive?
Yeah, well, that's...
Deliberation is fine, I understand, but I mean,
it's politics, I mean, I guess it's the same in
war is politics by any other mean. If there's someone who should understand politics, is by some degree, or at least some understand some end of politics, it should be someone who do martial practice, in my opinion. Now, to be fair, I mean, I really hated politics as well, but I've come to understand its role.
That's a very interesting perspective. Yeah. I need to reflect on that. That's a very interesting perspective. I don't like politics very much too, but I like watching and interpreting what politicians are doing. I mean, I'm not for this or that people. I'm just watching them like, wow, they deploy an incredible amount of money and energy to manipulate people. And I think it's amazing to see how it articulates and how people are in this system. I couldn't do politics or even talk about it because it's but to watch, it's quite fascinating.
It's purpose, right? Now, with corruption, obviously the purpose is a little bit different, but you have to at least admit that you don't get to that level without being highly motivated and pragmatic. So yeah, they know what they're doing. Now, if we go into further into politics, it's just we need to make sure that they're doing it for us, right?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
That's the conundrum of today's society, right?
Yeah,
anyway.
yeah. I mean, I think there was a point in the past where it was about do we prefer this idea or this one, and which path do we want to go? But no, we're reduced to are they doing that for us or for themselves? Sure. So basically, the possibles have reduced Koku.
But going back to more specifically the domain of Koryu, I mean, the mainline Daito Ryu is a pretty expensive organization. There's a lot of dojos all across the world, and clearly there's some political considerations in place, right? To a certain degree, I think. But then again, it serves a purpose, right?
Well, by definition, you cannot govern without politics. So if you have an organization, you need, to some extent.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to say is that the actual act of the actual political act has to serve a purpose. It's not just to politicking for politicking. And once you start to see it like that, then yes, there's certain practices that are more annoying than others. But from the standpoint of this is the objective they seem to have in mind, and trying to second guess that, understand it, then I think it becomes interesting, because it's basically trying to just promoting peace at the end.
Well,
not everyone does it with that in mind, but it doesn't mean that you cannot do it with that in mind.
Of course, but it's also easier in Koryu because you have something to protect. You have something higher than yourself. I mean, Daito Ryu, you have Daito Ryu, and
there is something of
after
value
this
that ought to be
teacher,
continued.
there will be another one, and I think this idea isn't very clear in Aikido, for instance, probably in other arts, and people end up fighting for themselves because they don't see the point in fighting for the arts, because there is no roots in tradition, and that's I think.
So why do you practice it? Would be the question. That seems obvious to me.
Yeah, I think it's more or less an interesting and good conclusion to all the discussions we had today. Actually, those Kobudo or Koryu or Daito Ryu or Aikido has a purpose in itself, or is it the people that makes it? Is there
an intrinsic purpose to a given Koryu school?
And just to finish the question, and is there a difference between, in that sense, I mean, the purpose of the Koryu or the Budo, does it change if it's rooted in tradition or not?
I think it does. I mean, it has to. I think if you're, and I wouldn't qualify myself as a historian, but if you're a half decent one, you need to develop a certain level of empathy to fully get all the lessons. But if you do, if you understand the history of your Ryuha, I mean, I would assume, at least in my case, I think it expanded my view and made me better suited to understand certain aspects of the school. Is there in today's world, intrinsic purpose to a Ryuha? Certainly not in the way that it used to. Ryuha traditionally in Japan would have various purposes. Some seem to have been privately held, and then just kind of like, it's a family thing, and maybe they give densho and licenses to a few people so that they could get some raise somewhere, under their daimyo. Others seem to have been clan run. My understanding is that Tatsumi, for instance, is pretty much an offspring of the Sakura-han, for instance, in Chiba. You have other schools down south, in the south of Japan also, that were kind of the same, where the installations were provided by the governorship of the region, and then the schools themselves were basically operating to maintain military readiness, right, to some degree. And then there's some schools that were practiced for a variety of other reasons, of course, right? But if we talk about those reasons that I've stated, I don't think we have anything like that here, right? I'm not aware of a Koryu that has a connection to the national police, for instance, in Japan, or at least one that's basically like advisory or on record. I don't think there's that many of those in the world either, if any. There are certainly practitioners of Koryu that are working in advisory capacity or training capacity with with either military or law enforcement officer. So in that sense, they serve that purpose in some way. A little bit indirect, I think, but still. I think most of the purpose, in my opinion, is twofold, but connected. You want to develop better, a better humanity, right? But again, connecting it back to pragmatism. I don't know if you're familiar with the Swiss Guard, right? I'm not sure if you're familiar with the history of the Swiss Guard, right? And why they were selected. Why they're Swiss.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
The Swiss were known as extremely skilled mercenaries. The reason for that is because of where Switzerland is located, right? It's basically in the middle and everybody wanted to take over. But the interesting fact of that, I think it's beginning of, it's like year 1100 or so kind of history. But they had, they didn't have, I believe, a standing army. What they did is everyone was trained as a pikeman. Yeah. And they had one philosophy: no quarters for invaders, right? I think that's a philosophy that still works because it's kind of the philosophy of Switzerland to this day.
Yeah.
Right? At least now in political military sphere. Right?
Well,
we're not going to go anywhere else. We're not going to go and bother you. Don't you dare come here because we're ready, right? And I think there is a value of cultivating, a similar sense of readiness personally, right? And again, I don't think you can really get there if you don't develop the humanity that's going to be behind people trying to uphold that readiness, right? So to me, that's how I see it, right? And then I could have used the hoplites as a good example as well, right? If you want to go to ancient Greece, but the idea that as a person who will not necessarily join a military, not be part of any sort of law enforcement, you are still responsible for keeping the peace in your own little way. And to be able to do that effectively and in a way that's meaningful, kind of helps if you're a good human being to start with.
Yeah, well, it's not just a tool; it helps forging the mind. And
so it's a way to get there. That's all it is.
Because if you want everyone to be able to defend himself, you can give guns to everyone, like the US do, and you you get that result.
If you want to look at that case, there's no training and there's no cultural unity, right?
So
unless a huge crisis happens.
So basically,
in Canada, which is also multicultural, we don't have the same multiculturalism issue. Why is that? Well, I would suggest, and maybe my American friends would say otherwise, but the long-standing tradition in the United States is generally to say you become American, you transform into an American, right? You're going to talk, walk, do everything American. In Canada, there's not really such a thing, right? Now, sure, there's some more conservative people that don't like change, but in general, we're all pretty friendly. And, we're all pretty happy about, working. One of the first jobs that I had was working with a Syrian woman, Iraqi woman, Syrian woman, Pakistani friend of mine, and like the various people from the Middle East, right? They didn't really change their attitude. Now, I'm sure they were kind of like, second, third generation, so it's like, you're kind of in between. You've adopted some of the things from our, ubiquitous in Canada, so on and so forth. But, there was no, it was just perfectly normal, I think, by and large. Where I went to school was kind of the same as well. So you need that culture. You need that cultural element, I think, if you want to get there. Otherwise, you can give weapons to everyone, but they're not trained. They don't have a sense of unity. Well, what's going to happen? They're going to turn their weapons against each other, right? If you go to Switzerland, everybody has weapons, right? A lot of people has weapons. I think it's the second most
number of people.
People holding weapons. Right?
But they've had a few problems the past 10 years, so they're trying to change. They're doing things,
but they had much less problem than the United States because I don't believe you can have the munition in your home.
Yeah, and actually Switzerland is 3 different cultures combined into one. True. So it's.
But you basically you don't have the munition in your home, if I understand correctly, and you need to keep proficiency. You need to go and get certified every year, if I recall. Right.
Yeah. Something about that.
It's to me it's the same thing with similar to like for instance women's or like just general self-defense program. If your goal to go and practice Koryu, or I would suspect even Gendai Budo, is self-defense, I'm not sure you're going about it necessarily the right way. Generally, self-defense programs are, you do it once a year, once every 6 months, and it's kind of it's a little bit more like CPR training than like a continuous training, right? You make sure that you have certain basics that are covered. You need to review them to make sure that you maintain readiness. And that's it. If we're talking about self-defense, right?
Yeah.
Now, obviously, but now again, if you want to go and train for longer hours so that you get that edge, sure, you can do that. But I'm fairly convinced that you're going to need a better reason than just developing self-defense in that case. It's going to have to be useful for something.
Yeah. Well, it's also highly contextual because no Japanese do martial arts for self-defense. I mean, it's not even in their mindset, self-defense. Well, what is it? I mean, but if you take Americans, some of them actually do need self-defense.
Yeah. Well, you have like in the Daito Ryu, you do have the Goshinyo no Te, right? So you do have technically a self-defense curriculum, but it's not taught until you're actually useful to the school. Basically, it's if you want to be, if you become Kyoju Dairi, that's something you need to get, in my understanding, right? So, again, that's purpose-driven, I think. And then to me, that's how I make sense of it all. I mean, I've seen people train years in dojo, get into physical confrontation, and drop out of the dojo the next day. Not because it ended bad, but just how they felt. They felt defeated. They felt they were not up to, they basically, imploded.
The victory or defeat is not the point. It's actually getting a real taste of fight. People really don't imagine what it is to fight. So the first time it happens, they're like, yeah, that's not what I want to do.
It's never going to be the way you think. There's a police officer friend of mine who was telling me, the only time I got into physical confrontation was when I was having a bad day in the first place. Right? By that I suppose that it's just he wasn't as ready, and the other person just felt it, and then they just went for it, right? So that's already a good lesson. Just stay healthy and strong. But yeah, I mean just knowing how to deal with aggression and knowing how to do de-escalation. There's a book in my reading list by Alexander. trying to make sure that I don't mix the pattern.
The Koryu? No, not the
No,
Koryu.
it's a book he wrote specifically on the subject of de-escalation. In the de-escalation in the case of dealing with the mentally distressed and so on and so forth.
I think I read
pathway, I forget the name, apologies.
I know we'll get it. I have all his books, so.
But that's on my reading list right now. It's probably the next book I'm reading. Then the next one after that is a different story. But those are more Koryu book to me than a lot of the Koryu material that I see coming out. Like in nature, right? No, obviously it's not Koryu, but like, in nature, it's serving a purpose. It's actually recognizing that the best fight is the one. It's cheesy to say, but the best fight is the one you're not getting into, right? That really means something different for someone who actually runs at a risk of getting to a fight actively on a daily basis or on a more regular basis. But going back to well, sorry, I lost the thread here.
The question was the intrinsic purpose of it.
Yes, so the intrinsic purpose is, to me, some people are going to find it like this, but just being able to be a good citizen and being one that's willing to maintain readiness.
Yeah, in that sense, it's not that much different than the purpose of Budo. So,
I think there, I don't think that there's a, you were mentioning the dichotomy between Budo and Koryu here, but Budo is just, is the creed in many ways, right? I don't think the creed itself needs to be different for Koryu than from Budo, fundamentally speaking.
But sometimes I have the feeling that Budo is kind of the
I don't think Budo buys in, like Gendai Budo buys into it as seriously as it should in some cases.
In the big picture, Budo looks like military training, basic military training, and Koryu looks like officer school. Looks like.
So that's an interesting point you're bringing here. One of the challenge that you mentioned that you brought up, I think, is that you have a lot of people walking into Koryu school that are not physically ready, or not mentally ready to, or they don't really understand what they're walking into. I was certainly someone who walked into a Koryu school not knowing what it is, so I wouldn't qualify myself. I was in very good physical shape. I wasn't necessarily in the physical shape that the school needed, and didn't have the body that the school needed. Mm-hmm. And I certainly wasn't mentally ready, I think, right? So obviously that makes things rather painful. Judo, Kendo, Iaido Federation, perhaps Aikido as well, can provide some foundation, I think. And in the case of many foreign Koryu practitioner, it certainly has, it seems. It provides some foundation, right? So it is a pathway in that sense. But if that's how you want to approach it, I think then it should be
also in the
made
sense
a little bit more that.
Budo has to teach to huge number of people, to the masses, and Koryu is smaller.
But take the Iaido Federation, for instance, right? When it doesn't get involved into scandals of, pay for grades kind of thing. The format, I think, is an interesting one. If there was one format to be emulated. To say that, because when you go, for instance, at a Taikai, at a certain level, you're doing all the 12 Zenken and Kata, but then, at some level, you're going to start to do your Koryu stuff as well, right? And everybody's doing Koryu, or I think pretty much everybody, right?
Well, at a certain level.
Yes. So I think that format is interesting, right? If you're explicitly making it so that, well, we're going to give you the basics here, but at some point you're going to get into, the road to Koryu is clear. I think that's interesting, right? But if you're talking about the various karate federation, judo, aikido, it's not been set like that, right? So accidentally, perhaps. I don't know how much intent there is.
Well, I still think that,
But-
especially in karate, actually, you have Koryu-like dojos in karate. It's
Sure.
the same thing in Aikido. You have Koryu-like small dojos with a teacher and like 5 students, and there is extensive training, physical training, mental training, and everything. You have both in Budo. You have like big dojos and really small Koryu-like dojos. But I mean, if I had to make just a big picture of Budo and Koryu, it would look like, training for the masses is Budo, and you have a training for the elite people, which is Koryu. And it's actually, there is a form of, I'm not making an opposition between Budo and Koryu, not at all. Just saying that in Budo, if you want to do 1 hour every Sunday morning to keep your body in shape, but you don't really give a shit to what you're doing. I mean, you're just doing Aikido because it's fun and spraying people. You're not really doing Budo. But you can. There is this offer, you can. And you will never end up studying really Budo. And if you want to be extremely serious about your practice, like, I mean, the decision I made to go to the Honbu Dojo, where I didn't find what I was looking for, because I was looking for something that was more like Koryu teaching, like one teacher, small group, this not uchideshi-like, but like master-student relationship.
Direct transmission, yes.
And I think that you may be able to find that in Budo, of course, but it is mainly how Kobudo works. So,
it's pretty much the fundamental mechanic.
When I see all those people in, like, Aikido, for instance, saying, I'm looking for my master, I want this connection, everything, I say, maybe you should actually do Daito Ryu. Maybe you should drop Aikido, because Aikido is not built to be taught like that.
Yeah, but that presupposes that, if you say Koryu, they're actually going to get what you're talking about. And that's where, like, you end up in the question of what is Koryu, and then it's a very hard question from that standpoint to answer, I think. So, as far as for looking for mentorship, I don't know what people are looking for in that. Like, I didn't go to Kondo Sensei for mentorship initially. I just went to school because that was on my way. Now, arguably, I've been fortunate enough to have, spend a lot of time with Kondo Sensei. And I've learned more than I expected about a whole bunch of subjects, including Daito Ryu. He happens also to be a collector of wadoke. Sometimes lending some of, he's one of the specialists in Japan. He lends some of his clocks to the National Museum in Ueno. He's also a specialist on Yamaoka tissue and has a lot of his calligraphy. As a matter of fact, around this time of the year, generally we close the dojo and put newspaper on all the windows so that we can just hang all the scrolls, basically all the calligraphy that he has in the dojo, and basically just let them aerate a bit. So, I mean, I don't understand why you would, like, I understand the value of it. I understand that people might want to look for that. I would easily say that 90% of my education in Daito Ryu specifically, the core teaching, yes, it's for Kondo Sensei, but the education itself, it's been all my senpai. So I think it's perhaps misguided to be looking for the ultimate master.
No,
look for a family instead.
Yeah, I wasn't really talking about the master himself, but more about this relationship.
Okay, so
you can, teacher, senpai, student, that you're supposed to have that in Budo, but it's not there.
Yes.
Not there. The truth is that it's
okay, so there. Just like, the senpai kohai kanke kind of thing.
Yeah, and you have senpai kohai at the Hanbu Dojo, for example, but it's the same senpai kohai relationship you would have in a Japanese company.
Okay.
It's not the same senpai kohai relationship you have in Koryu. People tend to misunderstand the senpai kohai relationship. You look on the internet, you see the definition, say, oh, okay, that's it.
Right.
Okay, let's put that in the dojo. But that's not it. In the senpai kohai relationship is that you don't have a teacher above you in the Japanese society. It's just there is one that comes before and one after.
Oh, you have a shacho, you have a kaicho, you have a...
Yeah, but there is no direct line between the shacho, then senpai, then kohai.
Right.
It's more a social structure or political structure in which some people have more power over other people. But
yes.
in Koryu, it's not a matter of power, it's a matter of knowledge and teaching. So
I suspect that's a function of modern Japanese society. Because in Japan as well, like in a lot of companies, the relationship, or more specifically, the responsibility that the senpai ought to take, not from a corporate standpoint, but from a company standpoint, but from a company culture standpoint, so to speak, right? Just like you need to pass on those traditions. You need to go for the nomikai. It's part of your job, so to speak, because you're going to have to pass some of the company culture to the younger generation, right? That's kind of going away. A lot of companies, you become senpai and it's just like, it's a power trip. And the reason for that, I suspect, is basically because you went from having one job for life to you need to skip jobs, right? So you don't have you lose a purpose to that, which is, I think, unfortunate, right? Now, if you go in a I've seen a lot of people like in Budo say, oh, I'm practicing this for life, like it's a lifestyle, right? It's a nice sentiment, but it's not that easy. And I've never met somebody who said that. Let me this way. All the people that I've met for whom it is, let's call it a lifestyle, they never had to say it out loud. They just live it. It's just what they do, right? Which is why it makes them hard to find, unfortunately.
Well, what's hard is when people say, what are your hobbies? And I'm like,
that's the one that I actually allow myself.
And I cannot say Aikido because it's not a hobby.
No.
But
it's something you do, but it's not a hobby.
Then the people say, but you do Aikido. Why didn't you? Because it's not a hobby, And I mean, regular people, even Japanese people, they really don't understand the
I do bring it up in conversation like that personally, just because it's the one way I can find to, just say, here's something I'm doing, and let's leave it at that. And it also gives you the chance to control the conversation, so that oh yeah, I do Aikido, and then it stops there. Or like I do, Daito Ryu in my case, but I do Daito Ryu and it kind of stops there. But yeah, like especially in Koryu, like people are familiar with Aikido, so
Yeah.
So often I'm gonna say I'm doing like Jujutsu, or I'm rarely gonna say that I'm doing Daito Ryu on the first try. It's probably gonna take like 3 times. Like people are gonna say, oh, so what are you doing? Oh, I'm doing some Jujutsu all the time. Oh, where are you training? Judo? It's like, oh no, it's a Koryu Jujutsu thing that I'm doing. It's like, oh, what is it? Like, if people keep digging, then yeah, I'll mention Daito Ryu. But in general, I mention it just so that it kind of, because it's something that I do. Don't really have hobbies. I just have things that I do that are in pursuance of Koryu as far as I'm concerned.
It's a list of
then there's my family. That's I'm not gonna say my family's not my hobby. My family's my life. So
yeah, well, it's a little strange because people will tell me, oh, what are you doing tomorrow? I heard it yesterday. Oh, tomorrow I have an interview with a guy, a Canadian guy doing Daito Ryu. It's going to be interesting. Say, oh, you're working on Sunday? Not really. Well, the guy behind the camera is working, but I'm not really. I don't see that work, you know.
No, and I don't think
have,
any.
Actually, I'm very happy that I could use the interview as a pretext to have the conversation. Could have been just the 2 hours in the bar, but it wouldn't have been really of interest for the community as a whole. So it's nice to have the conversation in front of the camera. But it's
well,
not
hopefully
work.
it shows an example of what I think, because I wasn't actually sure if I wanted to come today, to be perfectly honest. Not because we're not in good standing or anything of the kind, but because the people that you have previously interviewed, I think, are very, very serious people, right? Number one, and number two, and then I'm always worried that I can live to that kind of standard. And number two, in Koryu, it's very hard to talk about Koryu because there's so many things you can't talk about, or you shouldn't talk about. Not because they're, and yes, they're often referred to as secrets, but not because they're secret in nature. Just because of either the implication of sharing that knowledge openly, what that might have, or because even if you talk about it, you can't really make sense of it. Yeah. So people are just going to get the wrong ideas. And so I'm always a little bit careful about. I love having discussion of the subject, as I think I've made clear today. But I also kind of am careful in that because I want to make sure that whatever actually gets out there is actually going to be of not only of value, but actually it's going to serve a purpose that I feel is aligned with the values I have and the traditions I'm trying to uphold.
Well, I think that's the most important thing that people should remember from this interview. For those who watched 2 hours and a half or more
that's almost
of the
3
interview, it's not what we've said about Aikido Daito Ryu. It's more about in general how it influenced your life, brought you where you are, the way you talk about things. I think this way of being honest, self-reflection.
Readiness. There's if because I think we're drawing to a close here, but one of the, I'm not a calligraphy expert, but one of the most significant piece of calligraphy that I've ever seen is one by Takahashi Deshu. He has this calligraphy. I think I sent it to you. I sent a picture to you. It's basically, he used to do a lot of skulls on his calligraphy, and the translation of what he wrote is, had I not been born, I would not live. I wouldn't have to die. But because I have, I will. There's a, to me that there's, if I had to basically find one piece of writing that describes, what Koryu is to me, is the notion of readiness. It's just like, it's going to happen. Yeah. So be ready.
Totally agree with that. I think it's a perfect conclusion. And it's been 2 hours and a half, or maybe more. I think people are going to hate us for that extremely long interview again.
Hopefully you'll make use of creative editing. But,
no, we don't edit that much as interviews. But I'm really happy. All those interviews are 2 hours, 3 hours. And it means that we can actually have interesting long talks that's more or less stay on the main topic.
Well, feel free to cut that one in half if it's going to help the audience. Like I said, it's it's a subject that's dear to my heart, obviously, but so thank you for having a discussion with me.
Thank you very much for your time, and we'll certainly have many more conversations.
Oh, I'm sure.
But hopefully maybe in front of the camera again. There are no not much practice because of this current situation, but let's hope that we will soon get back to
Fingers crossed, yes.
Somewhat standard. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And actually, the next interview is tomorrow afternoon with Guillaume Erard. It's going to be in English and not in French, despite the fact we're both French, just to keep consistency in the series. We're going to talk about education, and we're not going to publish before January because we already have this one to publish, hopefully before the end of the year. So it's soon Christmas, and it's really busy time, but we're doing our best to produce and publish as soon as possible. Thank you very much for staying that long on this video, and I see you soon for the next one. Thank you very much.